Awesome. This is an elective on Twitter and tear gas, social media and the public sphere. We're going to be talking a lot more about like things that are like beyond Twitter, like just social media generally, but like I like the alliteration. So Twitter and tear gas is the name of the elective, but we're going to talk about Facebook and YouTube and the internet, generally speaking, and more than tear gas. We'll talk about like pepper spray also. Just kidding. Like just like force, like police force, state force generally. So the subtitle for this lecture is Social Media and the Public Sphere. This is a diagram that I drew. Can everybody see the diagram? Awesome. So we're just going to like walk through this for a second just to familiarize ourselves with the concept that I want us to kind of interrogate later on by asking how the social media, social media has interacted with or changed this process. And you can take notes if you want, but also I'll make all of my notes and all of my little doodles and diagrams available at the conclusion of the lecture somewhere. I don't know where yet, but I'll tell you where. So this little middle circle right here, I have labeled the public sphere. It's just like this giant circle. And I think for those of you who are familiar, the public sphere is a concept developed by the sociologist Jürgen Habermas. Habermas is still alive. He's awesome. He's out there writing, doing things. You should Google him. And Habermas envisioned the public sphere as a virtual or an imagined community where individuals could convene to discuss problems that they faced as members of a public. What's really interesting about the public sphere for Habermas is it didn't necessarily have to be an identifiable physical space. The spatial elements of the public sphere are not necessarily self-evident, but it's definitely a forum that individuals can come together to create what's called public opinion. So you see these little two arrows, like the public and then counter publics meet together in the public sphere to form opinion. But this model is not necessarily super clean. It's not as if the public sphere is just a place where individuals go and they have their conversations and then that's it. It's super tidy and nice and they all know how to debate and talk because they all went to GDS. It's impacted and compounded by lots of forces. So the public sphere can be influenced by things like advertisement that come from corporatism. It can be influenced by society, which has like a larger role that plays. Think about like memes here, right? Like the way copy pastas influence social thought over time. And it can also have force applied to it by the state. In turn, though, the public sphere has the ability to influence society and the state and corporatism as well, but there's definitely social forces that are coming in that are not just individuals who are meeting as equals to convene and have dialogue. Those individuals meet to convene to have dialogue as equals, sure, but with the extra force, the unilateral force sometimes coming from the society, from the state, from corporate advertising, and we'll talk about all of that. Once that happens, once they can like kind of form public opinion of some sort and opinion gets formed, it goes through this process of debate and dialogue that kind of filters things down. And then the public sphere ends with these little like cultural units of production. Those are the things that the public sphere leaves us with, the kind of things that we can all more or less agree on, the ways in which public opinion has resulted in things being created. These cultural units of production can be things like commonly consumed art, often referenced journals, newspaper articles that make big headway. It can be I think a potpourri of all of those things. So like, I think mask wearing is super interesting right now. Like, I don't know about y'all, but like I was working part-time for a while, like maybe a few months ago, just cause like I needed like a pandemic job. I was working part-time at this like Qdoba. So I'm not sure if y'all have Qdobas where y'all are from, but like Qdoba is like better Chipotle is like better Chipotle. Chipotle is trash. Qdoba is like better Chipotle, the Dobes. And people come into like the Dobes all the time, not wearing a mask, especially whenever there's this huge there's this large sign on the door that says like you have to wear a mask, otherwise you can't come inside. Mask wearing is like a thing that you have to do, and people are like, I just can't read it. They just go inside all the time. So America is having this super interesting, unique phenomena of individuals who are pushing back on this concept of mask wearing. So we can take mask wearing as like opinion how public opinion is shaped in the US, and it's influenced by the state for sure, right? Like you have Donald Trump and the White House who are constantly putting out information in media. Donald Trump and Mike Pence refuse to wear masks when they tour factories, that kind of thing. The governor of Michigan is like the only person, like Greta, I forgot her name. Maybe it's not Michigan. Greta something, Whitmire. She's like the only person that was able to get Trump to like wear a mask in a public place. So that's influence force from the state, right, entering into those areas. Similarly, states and counties that have like been proactive in finding individuals, like just giving you a ticket if you don't wear a mask, like Karen, here's $50 you have to pay to the city. That's also force. That's the state influencing public opinion. Society, I mean, this is everything from the conversations that you and I are having, and corporatism. This is everybody that's like, oh, it's a pandemic, wear a mask and also buy a BMW. Like both of those things. So corporatism, advertisement, the state always influences public opinion. And this process, Habermas iterated, was a process that was pretty clean. I mean, at the time, it didn't involve the public sphere. And it kind of looked like this. I'm going to share another screen. That's the same diagram, isn't it? This is not the right one. Shared window to the front. Stop share. How do I do this? Here we go. This is it. Okay. Share screen. This one. Everybody see this diagram now? Awesome. So interlocutors. This is just like a fancy word for people who find themselves in conversation with each other. So you and I are interlocutors. We're finding ourselves in conversation with each other for a common purpose or some kind of intention. And interlocutors have this like dialogue spiral. They just do their thing, they talk, but they're bound. They have very specific limits set on the parameters of the communication. This is kind of that like cone that was in the previous diagram. It's bound by rules of persuasion. The traditional social media traditional public sphere without social media is bound by persuasion, it's bound by time, it's bound by language, and it's bound by space. So what do I mean by these? Think about time as one that's like, I think most substantive. Something that I think is super fascinating is some people have like this habit. I wish I like found one. So for example, Trump has this like tweet from like 2014 when like Obama was president. And he's like, the tweet says something like, President Obama has a direct obligation to hug every single person that contracts the Ebola virus. Like, it's kind of like a ridiculous thing to say. Sorry, I keep pausing that. It's kind of like a ridiculous thing to say, like President Obama has an obligation to hug everybody that has the Ebola virus. But like, it's interesting because that tweet was like in 2014, but now I could go back if I wanted to and subtweet that. And I can be like, does this still apply to COVID-19 now that you're the president? Like, interesting. So time is no longer the same kind of parameter and limit placed on interlocutors in the social media public sphere. It's not a physical bound. I'm not bound similarly by space. Right now, you and I, this is an interesting example. We're participating in a social media oriented public sphere because space, geospatial space, is no longer binding or putting limits on the kind of interlocution that we're capable of participating in. Similarly, language, I don't know about like y'all, but like I just like love like the Google Translate feature for like Twitter all the time. I'm just like constantly like translating tweets that I don't know. I'm like, oh, this is in French, so it must be really cool. And then I like translate it and it's like oftentimes not that cool. It was just in French. But language is like a thing that no longer binds us in social media. And then persuasion. This is like one of the last ones. Typically, oration's important. As debaters, we focus on style, especially as world schools debaters. And like, we can sometimes, I think, be aghast, right, at like the distinctions between like the Pete Buttigieg speakers who are just very, very clean and like crisp, and those individuals who are not very awesome and great speakers. But social media changes the rules of persuasion also, such that individuals no longer necessarily have to be super persuasive in the same ways of responding to location, time, and language, but the entire element of persuasion, the ways in which one is able to be convinced, is changed completely because of the vast array of information at your disposal, the differences of places it's coming from, all that kind of stuff. So interlocution in this process, this is again, this box represents the public sphere without the intervention or rise of social media. It leads to judgment, right? We create judgment system that interacts with audience. and interlocution will happen, and the audience will kind of be an outside spectator that processes, receives, and does their own kind of thing with judgment, such that you can imagine a second box that looks exactly like this appearing right underneath the word judgment, and the process starts over. And that's how it happens. That's how the social that's how the public sphere tends to function if we were to use diagrams to try and explain a process that happens largely interpersonally. But social media changes that. So here's a different diagram that I drew also that I think helps explain what happens when awesome. Everyone see this diagram? Great. So social media is totally different. Now, instead of interlocutors, you have a series of authors who are oftentimes not necessarily in direct conversation with each other in the form of communication, but are authoring posts, things like Twitter posts, Instagram posts, retweeting things, and a series of judgments are being created with the help of audience, right? Now individuals are liking things, they're disliking things, they're retweeting things, they're sharing content. So a series of authors are interacting with each other's content, while audience on the side has a more participatory role in the judgment factors that content creates. It's also unbounded. It's no longer bounded by rules of time. Authors can interact with posts created by authors from days, weeks, or months ago. They can also interact with content maybe from several years ago. The rules of persuasion also change. Language changes. I can interact with individuals who speak Arabic on Twitter. I can interact with individuals who speak French or Farsi on Discord forums, and just use like AI algorithms that automatically translate our text for us if we're talking verbally. And the rules of space. I can talk with individuals regardless of where they are on the location of the earth. And this changes, I think, a lot of things. It changes everything. I think it changes the entirety of the democratic process as we know it, which is why this lecture is about social media and the public sphere, or Twitter and tear gas, because the process of democratization is one that oftentimes is met with force from the state or from individuals, and it's a process that requires honing and a process that requires a lot of thought and deliberation. So we're going to talk about all of that. But before we dive into some more notes for the lecture, just because I don't want to like talk the entire time at y'all, I'm going to invite a small conversation on just our reception of those diagrams and the primary distinctions, if they make sense, what we're taking from them, and at least right now in the lecture, if we have any preemptive questions. Like anybody can go, but also if you don't have any questions, that's fine too. Go for it, Ashley.
I mean, this is kind of referring to like the last diagram, but recently what I noticed with like, just like current events, the audience has played a larger role in like social media itself and like perpetuating what we believe in like just everyday life. Do you think that that diagram would change depending on like the audience that it's reflecting on, or like the amount of people that it reaches? Because I feel like I think that the last diagram, obviously it's like accurate, but I was wondering what role the audience played there, because it just seems like the audience is on the sidelines when really I feel like it plays a larger role within social media.
Sure, I think that's definitely true. I think audiences play a larger role, and maybe I could draw some additional diagrams to illustrate what's happening in the role of audience. I'll flag that so that we can like talk about it more specifically as we move through the lecture. But what I think is really interesting about social media that I want to note here, and we'll talk about this later on. Like, how many of you are on Twitter? Like, I'm on Twitter. I just really like Twitter. I don't know if you can follow me on Twitter because like safety, environment rules. Plus my Twitter is like way too political for like my own liking sometimes. But like I will tweet things and I'll get like at the most like 15 likes on a tweet. And when I do, like it transforms my day. And sometimes I'll click on tweets and I'll be like, what are the number of engagement? And it'll be like, oh, 125 people saw this tweet. That's like not very high. But on Twitter, most of my feed is like people who like have seen similar tweets I have because they're constantly being retweeted. Like memes are a great example of this. So I think that the role that audience plays in social media, and we'll talk about this, is actually way more, like there's still that engagement, but it's way more on the side headlines. I really think it is. So on Twitter, there's this phenomenon called the 80-20 phenomenon. So 80% of content that you see that has like thousands of retweets and likes is generated by 20% of all Twitter users. Like I promise you that Lil Nas X is like one of those 20%. And like we're just always seeing his content every day, all day on Twitter. But we're not always seeing Nicholas Aranda's content on Twitter. Like I'm tweeting every single day, I promise you, but I'm doing it for myself. It's almost like an electric journal or like a diary. But the content that I'm interacting with as audience is things that I'm retweeting. So my ability to do something like retweet, to like, or to share, it's interesting because in some ways it shatters the audience author binary, right? But in some clear ways, there's still that lack of nuance where there's like Lil Nas X is the one that did write this tweet. But every time that I retweet Lil Nas X's tweet, I'm engaging in that kind of like zigzag thing where I'm passing it around and I'm at the very least definitely playing a role in that process of judgment creation, that squiggly line that goes down. But the authorship and audience binaries are important, I think, because on social media, even though it's supposedly and itself towards debate. People in debate rounds will be like, oh, the internet's like the most democratic thing to ever exist. In a lot of ways, that's true. But the majority of the audience on almost all platforms are all listening to a very specific high-profile population of individuals. So in some ways, it's one of the more undemocratic forums that's ever existed, in the sense that it's found a way to convince entire populations to dedicate their time, resources, energy, and emotional capital towards high-profile individuals who create the majority of the content that all we really do is just retweet or share in the form of memes. Awesome.
I had a question.
So Habermas identified the public sphere as having a few specific stakeholders that we're going to talk about. Again, this is like the traditional method of the public sphere. And it's
I had
not
a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. When does the audience become the author? Because oftentimes like the audience can like subtweet or like or reshare. Does that mean that they essentially become the author, or is it like clear that an author is an author when like they have their own post or like their own comment?
This is a great question. So obviously, like on some platforms like YouTube or Twitter, we know who the authors are because of things like handles. But think about things like I mean, we can stay on those platforms, but there's like, everyone know what copy pastas are? Okay, has everyone seen the copy pasta? And it's like, all girls born after 1998 know how to do is eat hot chip, lie, and like charge their phone. Has anyone seen that? I'm seeing some nodding, I'm seeing some no's. Okay, I'm gonna find maybe a better one that like is more famous. I thought that one was pretty famous. Okay, well, like copy pastas are just like text that will put over and over on images, but nobody for the most part knows where the actual text came from. They're just copied over and over on memes. So obviously, yeah, some things have very specific and explicit authors, and authorship can become like really obvious. But I think another good example is like social media and fan art. People will constantly just like repost things that are images without like crediting artists or authors. And if I'm retweeting, I'm definitely, I think, sharing or endorsing in some level that kind of content. So it creates a mixture there. But I think that at the very least, the point here, Mia, is to note that social media changes those parameters of like time, language, space, such that the entire process, like maybe authorship isn't even as relevant anymore in social media. I'm not entirely certain, but like we'll try and parse all those things out. Awesome. Can everyone see my screen? Cool. Just because I'm curious, what do you see? Like, do you see my background, or do you just see like the note page?
Just the note page.
Just the note
Oh,
page.
that's cool. That's better. Okay. So Habermas said there was a series of actors relevant to a traditional public sphere. Right. So first, you had individuals who were lobbyists, and these are people who didn't represent themselves. They represented a special interest group, just like in today, and like Congress and stuff. Then you had advocates, and advocates are people who still do not represent themselves, but they represent those who are marginalized or don't have the same power in the public sphere. Then you have experts, and experts have testimonial power on subjects and content and authority, right? Like ostensibly. Then you have moral entrepreneurs. I don't know how to spell that. There we go. And these individuals are trying to use the public sphere to bring individuals back towards a sense of morality, maybe through things like moral panic, inducing scare, reminding others of virtue, pointing out moral atrocity, that kind of thing. And finally, you had intellectuals, which are distinct from experts. Habermas said that experts had a specific purpose. They were experts in content and they're there to advise. Intellectuals were there to learn, to have thought-provoking activity, and to challenge common thought in the public sphere. So there's a distinction, right? So like an expert might go in and say, if you wear a mask, the rate of not for disease transmission changes from X amount to Y amount. If you were for Habermas an intellectual, you would go and you would ask questions about liberties, rights, and mask wearing, and those intersections. You try and parse those things out, that kind of thing. These are the actors that typically exist in the social public sphere. And I think that a lot of these actors are the same in the social media public sphere, but their roles and their powers change. All right, I'm gonna delete all this. Whoop, okay. So I think a few things that are interesting to know about social media. First is this concept of homophily, right? This is the thing that happens in regular sociology. Homophily is the tendency for us to find individuals who are like us, who share similar interests, who have, I think, similar backgrounds. If you've ever heard of the saying, birds of a feather stick together, it's the idea that individuals who have like backgrounds, similar characteristic or belief systems will oftentimes flock together, A, because it's comfortable, and B, because it helps to strengthen their belief in those systems or those characteristics. Does anybody know what, like, I don't know about y'all, but like tiny hat boys? Does anyone know what tiny hat boys are? Like hashtag tiny hat boy? I'm seeing some no's, maybe a couple yeses. Also, I'm on screen share mode, so I can't see all your faces. Okay, so a tiny hat boy, I wonder if I Google this, what happens? Because maybe that's like not what I want to happen. Google Chrome. Google Chrome. I can't open Chrome for some reason. Okay, so I wish I had a beanie in my room. Like this is just like a hashtag for like a type of Tumblr boy, like small beanies, and they'll like roll them up really, and they were like long ankle socks that like pass their leg, and they'll like go around on the skate park, and they'll ride scooters. These are tiny hat boys. It's like an entire aesthetic. It's a culture, right? So if I were a tiny hat boy, which I'm not, I might like be able to post on my Instagram photos, hashtag tiny hat boy, and you would see me with like my skate outfit, like my hat, my tiny hat. And then if I clicked on that hashtag, I could find like 25,000 other tiny hat boys. And then I would find a community of individuals. So what's really interesting about social media, knowing that like we eradicate all of those different boundaries of typical interlocution, is like some of the phenomena that are very explicit. Like this can help us make our warrants. If I warrant something like hashtag me too, I'm taken to an entire forum of other individuals who also have that kind of narrative, that kind of story. I can find them. So the natural process of homophily, of picking our friends in our societies because they're like and often, is one, amplified, but two, made easier in the public sphere. This process is amplified because my population size is larger and the interest that I have exposure to widens, but also it allows me to like codify or find strength in those beliefs because that community is so easily accessible, such that I can actually expand my community or find totally new ones. So I can now find niche communities with far less friction. Go ahead, Ashley.
How is homophily like emphasized by like social media platforms and like algorithms and things like that? Like,
great question. We're going to talk about algorithms here in like a sec. But algorithms are like, I think, really scary and really awesome. There's a book that I'm gonna like link here. Wow. I can't type. I don't remember the exact title of the book, but it's called Weapons of Math Destruction, How Algorithms Do X. It's an awesome book. I highly recommend it. If anybody's interested, I can get you some like PDF chapters for free. Not the whole book because like copyright laws. But I'll also like send them one at a time. Algorithms are super interesting because algorithms function off of what are called GANs, generative adversarial networks. I can't spell adversarial. So GANs are awesome because you have AI one. Let's say S1 is to figure out how to make a bomb panini. Like that's just its job. This AI one is to figure out how to make an awesome panini. But AI 2's job is to figure out how to stop AI 1 from making that panini, right? So AI 1 has task A, and AI 2 has task B, which is stop task A. So depending on whichever algorithm is successful, A1 or A2, it doesn't matter, right? Like if I want a panini, I will actually be happy with either of these algorithms working. Here's why. Because let's say the AI2 wins. Like this is the algorithm and it wins and it stopped AI1 from making my panini successfully. What I can now do is I can take AI1 and use AI2 to train it. This is what's known in algorithms as the security paradox. So what happens is if I try and create better malware to protect against AI intrusions, I'm giving the malware that does intrusions the code to make itself better. All AI functions off of GANs, where they will use adversarial networks to generate better and faster skills. So all algorithms are, in that sense, fairly neutral, because you can train an algorithm to do anything. But whatever you train an algorithm to do, you're providing the kind of feed supply to give a counter algorithm its method better and faster. Algorithms in social media have the ability to do things like make echo chambers more likely because they use homophily, a concept that we already use, to make their AI one. So like, think about it. Like the AI first has to know kind of what we like. So it uses our own information, our homophilia. So homophilia, I think, like cultivating like echo chambers, all of that would happen, I think, without algorithms. But algorithms intensify that process because they use data sets to make themselves better. Go ahead, Caroline.
So wouldn't like these metrics, like algorithms or other things that like solidify homophily, be like some sort of like parameter or like boundary on like discourse in social media?
Definitely, they can be, which is one of the ways that we have to question if the internet is actually a democratic institution. Because if we know that individuals are A, already prone to cultivate their own social groups, and that B, algorithms intensify those social groups and the content individuals see, it's questionable if things like actual pushback occur on social media platforms. All great questions. Cool. We're going to keep talking. Naz, Naz, go ahead.
So just thinking about social media users in general, it doesn't necessarily reflect like the true diversity we see in the world. So how do you think like flawed data sets can affect the algorithms we see in social media?
Next, but I think that there's something about your question that's explicit. Like how do algorithms change the way that we see social media in the world? I think that what's important to note is that more and more individuals are getting on the internet all the time, like especially in like the global South, right? Like more people are. I think like the World like Data Organization says that like close to 50% of individuals over the age of 14 have an online presence. Like that's a pretty high number. Obviously, as like infrastructure like expands access in the global South, we're going to see more and more types of diversity on social media. I think that algorithms have the ability to do three things that impact, I think, maybe how we see others and how we see the world. One, it has to do with that homophilia argument, right? It just codifies our echo chambers. But two, algorithms intensify things like targeted advertising. Not only can we find our common peers easier, other individuals, like companies and the state, can find us easier. And then third and finally, I think that algorithms have a real way of making a lot of our tasks easier. So they reduce the necessity for human capital. Algorithms reduce the necessity for us to think about other individuals as necessary parts of a social sphere because they might be replaceable by things like artificial intelligence. Cool. But this brings us to what I want to talk about next, which is the idea of digital dualism. The idea that the internet is somehow a less real world. This phenomenon is really common and it makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? Like I had not played Animal Crossing. Has anybody on here like played Animal Crossing? Wow. I see like an embarrassed nod. Yeah. It's fun. I think it's fun. I've never played. It looks fun. But, right, like in some ways, Animal Crossing shows what this idea is intuitive. Like you're not a real animal. It's like a virtual. But digital dualism it's false. It's entirely false, right? So if we think back to the demo debate yesterday, where Michael and Emily's large point was that Facebook literally leads to like the codification of genocide in Myanmar. The internet's very real. Just because I think like the like installation of a process starts virtually doesn't mean that its impacts aren't corporal. I think that this is like a 2000s naivety that the internet's somehow a less real world, and it's a notable phenomenon. We can see some success behind Middle Eastern protests in the Arab Spring because governments were like, oh, the internet isn't real, right? Like in Cairo in Egypt, like Mubarak was literally ousted from power largely because of social media organization. And we have evidence of his cabinet being like, don't worry about it, bro. Like they're all on Facebook. Facebook's not real. And in like in the early 2000s, whenever he was ousted from power, respond, his gun tracking, I think, media presence, because it was somehow less real. It was more naive. In a lot of ways, I think that we find ourselves desensitized, or I think like not taking certain atrocities as seriously because we see them online. And this is all, I think, the result of digital dualism, this idea that there's two distinct worlds, one here on like the physical planet Earth and one that happens online, and it's separate. And I think what's so interesting is that generational gaps, I think, can codify this perception. Individuals who are quite literally not as often on the internet are like, oh, it's a separate world with separate users. They're younger, they're different, and in some ways this is kind of true. There are two distinct, perhaps, worlds that interact in the same world, but it's not a less real world, principally because individuals are all the time still seeing actual change come from it, and they're all the time seeing actual suffering come from the online segment of the population. But I think what's also interesting is that only a segment of the population needs to be connected digitally for the entire environment to be changed by social media. I think another great example is still the Arab Spring, when social media for the first time was being used for organization to try that even though social media was heightened in the Middle East and individuals were having organization capacities on Facebook for some of the first time, only about 30% of individuals who were active in the protests in Tahrir Square actually had Facebook profiles. Their kids, their uncles, their cousins had them. And you only need that amount of organization to affect the entire offline population. I think another great example is that online conversations can force different offline conversations all the time, especially with parents and things like that. Awesome. Are y'all familiar with cute cat theory? Well, you should be. Cute cat theory is the idea that the majority of users, roughly 85% of internet users, want to use the internet for some kind of more banal activity. Cute cats. It's true. And so the cute cat theory of the internet says oftentimes things like censorship are unsuccessful because of pushback from individuals who just want to do things like post cute cat photos and don't want to be engaged in highly political conversations. And this is a real phenomenon. A number of countries individuals, corporations have tried to do things like enact censorship restrictions on social media platforms. And the number one pushback they get never comes from activists. It's not from individuals who are like, wait a second, we're losing the most democratic platform for outreach. It's not activists who do the most pushback. It's individuals who are like, wait a minute, I use the internet to post pictures of my cute cats and to blog, and don't take that away from me. And then you get, the result is a large democratic populace that will all fight for internet freedom. This is disproportionately beneficial for activists. Why? Why do we think that, like, the cute cat theory, or the fact that most individuals want to use the internet for non-political purposes, is really good for those that want to use it for political purposes? I'm just like curious your thoughts. Go for it, Caroline.
If the people that are pushing back only want to use the internet for like these mundane or banal reasons, and that doesn't justify like the government digging its heels in and like pushing back even further. Whereas if it was like internet activists that were like pushing back, it would like create a dichotomy where the government could continue oppressing those people by the justification that they were doing so.
100%. So this brings us back to the rule that only roughly 30% of a given population needs to be online for online discourse to fully seep into offline conversations, right? This also brings us back to the 80-20 rule of Twitter, that 20% of all content is generated by 80% of all users. Sorry, that's vice versa. Users generate 80% of all content. This is high profile content, content that we see most often. Cute cat theory. Go for it, Victor.
Earlier, you mentioned the digital dualism and how the Arab Spring and other movements like in Ukraine, like basically the politicians did not really consider a threat. But now that like those democratization movements have succeeded in like 2020 and earlier, like do we have instances of politicians now realizing that the internet is important and how they've used specific tasks to suppress democratization online?
Yeah, great question, Victor. So before I answer that, to this article, 2008 by E. Zuckerman, this is the author that outlines cute cat theory, if you're just like interested in doing more research on cute cat theory. Yeah, so there definitely was, like, digital dualism is responsible for a naivety that I think older generations have about the internet that leads to governments not responding to it. But some governments never had that problem, right? Like China had the internet 2.0. And at the very beginning, they were like, we're going to have the internet and we're going to give it to everybody, but we're going to control it in its entirety because we recognize exactly how powerful a tool this is. So this is what I want us to think about the internet in terms of a weapon of mass destruction. This was China's mentality in their approach. One second, Ashley. China in like the 1970s was like, okay, the Cold War is by and large over. What from the Cold War is the newest, most powerful tool that nations have at their disposal? And they decided that it was the internet. And they created mass censorship blocks in the Great Wall of Great Firewall of China, the GFWC, and we'll talk about that more extensively. But I think that China is a good example of a nation that never experienced that naivety up front because they were taught by the Cold War of its power. And I think that we see that all the time right now with the protests going on today. Before I continue this, though, I'm going to take Ashley's question real quick.
So is the reason why China like can circumvent the cute cat theory because they like created their own like entire website, like internet, where they like self-censor everything? Is that the reason why?
Exactly. So China took the cute cat theory kind of and ran with it. They were like, we think that most people are pretty docile. They don't really want to push back against us. They want to use this platform to do things like watch YouTube videos. And for the most part, they've been really right. You can, the Great Firewall of China looks exact. You can think of it as an exact replica of the internet. It's like not the same. It's like a duplicate. Like all of the things that you can find in America on the internet by and large kind of exist, maybe from like from the same places and the same ways, but without any access to content about Tiananmen Square or democracy or the cute cat theory. And individuals, for the most part, don't push back because they can do it all. They can like share the cute cat photos, they can create videos on Twitch, they can live stream things. They just can't access any dangerous content. But because the cute cat theory works the way it does, that's beneficial for activists in democratic nations, but really bad for activists in China, right? Because people in China aren't going to push back. Why? Because the internet allows them to do all the things that most people want to use it for in the first place. Okay. So in what ways do we think the internet is like a weapon of mass destruction? Because this is like a kind of an insane comparison in some ways. Like WMDs can like blow up entire cities and entire countries. And we just finished talking about how the internet is just like for cute cats. So in what ways is the internet synonymous with the weapon of mass destruction? Go for it, Mia.
The perpetual cycle of echo chambers, especially because we allow ourselves to propagate in the beliefs of like, again, like the, what was it called, homophily that you mentioned. Like everyone can just come onto a platform and say like, I believe in this and like blah, blah, blah. And the only way that like we can allow for actual discourse is like with real life discourse essentially. But these echo chambers only perpetuate like really harmful beliefs that extend beyond just social media, but into society as well.
Okay, yeah, that's one possibility. Sure, Victor.
Like as you said earlier, any mechanisms that arise on the internet can have corporal effects, like in a mass pandemic or in a natural disaster. When you turn off the internet, you don't have a lot of information, so you might accidentally get killed, go to the wrong zone, and might not get treated. So it does have like corporal impacts.
Definitely. Okay, so that's it. That gets closer to what I'm talking about. The internet, it's infrastructure, but at the same time that it's infrastructure, it maintains infrastructure like itself, right? So like bridges, roads, highways, hospitals, all those things are infrastructure. It's a digital highway. At this time, it's the tool that maintains that digital highway. The example I think I gave Victor in office hours, in like 2017, we hired Amazon to try and figure out, hey, what are like some really crafty, cool things that Russia could do to the US if they wanted to using the internet? And Amazon came up with like 5 ideas that they thought their technology could do. They were like, hey, you know, if Russia wanted to, they could just pick a county hospital and use a simple randomization algorithm and randomize every patient's blood type. Like that would be insane, right? So like I'm a nurse and I go into the hospital, I'm just doing my job. I pick up my iPad and I'm like, okay, this patient, like Nas, takes like A, B minus C, D, something blood type. And I just like give it to her because like it's in the computer. I'm just doing my job. And perhaps in the span of 6 hours, I could get a bunch of nurses by doing their job to administer wrong blood types to hundreds or thousands of patients, resulting in their deaths, right? So the internet is a weapon of mass destruction because it literally has the ability to do things like cripple democracies, right? Like if we know that from the like Mueller report that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, then we know that like Russia stole a free election from the country that's supposed to have all the free elections, right? Like it crippled democracy. It can do things like change the rules of warfare. And it can do things, I think, like change the game of espionage and tracking. So this is where the internet is not necessarily a tool for the people, right? Because, okay, does anybody follow Trump on Twitter? No? That's good. All doing the healthy thing there by not following Trump on Twitter. But if you were to go to Trump's Twitter, like 2 days ago, Trump posted a series of what look like wanted posters of individuals. I'm not sure if you've seen these, but they're people who were in like Lafayette Park participating in a series of protests. First of all, like that's just insane. Like it's just absolutely insane that the commander-in-chief is targeting individual citizens in the form of wanted posters. Just crazy. But not uncommon in other countries, right? Like not uncommon in Saudi Arabia, not uncommon in Egypt, not uncommon in China, not uncommon in Iran, for individuals to be the subject of specific surveillance tactics and targeting. In some ways, the internet is very democratic. It's very good for protests. The cute cat theory is beneficial, but we also know that we all have an IP address. Like every single one of us right now has a specific way that we can track us, right? We know that things like photos can capture us, things like facial recognition technologies. We know that governments can track individuals and societies much more effectively. So in some ways, it's interesting because the internet can be a very democratic tool in nations that are already democracies. But like China's shown us, the internet can also be a very authoritarian tool for nations that know how to control it and use it and control the population that uses it as users. Awesome. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about? More notes. I just realized that I may have skipped a page. It's okay. I think we talked about that indirectly, even though maybe I didn't say all of it. Okay, last thing that we're going to talk about before we switch to questions and then maybe a more open conversation with our last bit of time. Oh, this is cool. I skipped this, but you can like still go find this. While Ghonim, he is the individual that in Egypt created a Facebook event for January 25th, 2011. And he created, and he had no idea what Facebook events really did. He was like, oh, this is cool. And approximately 10,000 people showed up to his Facebook event to protest in Tahrir Square. And like that was insane. It was like insane. You can like still go find that Facebook event. He had no idea it was gonna happen. There's like an interview with him somewhere where he was just like, yeah, I was just like doing my thing, man. But the internet, I think, gets rid of what is often known as pluralistic ignorance. Does anybody know what this is? Pluralistic ignorance? Pluralistic ignorance is not knowing that the sentiment that you're experiencing is shared by a large group. Right? So if you're sitting in a class, right, and it's like a math class, and maybe you're like, everybody seems so into this, they're all taking notes, and I'm so bored. Wow, that might be an example of pluralistic ignorance. Because if like everybody in the room is also bored, then like you don't know. So the group is ignorant of the fact that it's a group, which is just an insanely intriguing phenomenon for a group to be ignorant of the fact that it's a group. But this happens all the time, but it happens less and less often in the world of social media, because we can find our groups far more easily. And two other concepts to cover, and then we'll talk about things. Just because I skipped this page of notes, is the rise of citizen journalism. I know that like you're all pretty familiar with this. This is the ability for individuals to get rid of a process of gatekeeping, right? So it disrupts gatekeeping and traditional media. So a journalist during most of the Arab Spring that were really in the Gezi protests were known as the 140 Journo Collective. And they were just a group of citizens that like were responsible for keeping track of most of the protests. Riot Unicorn is like one of my favorites. They're like a citizen collective group that are like all over the US, and they just document riots. They're really good, actually. And there's harms to this, obviously, right? Like there's less editing and it flattens the news process, and they can lead to information overload. Awesome. Last concept that we're going to cover, and then we'll have a conversation, and then you can all go. But this is the attention economy. And it's a new kind of economy that exists, I think, online in an interesting way. So attention is oxygen for movements. Now, like without it, movements don't take off, because even activism kind of even activism offline follows that 80-20 rule. Think about like traditional protests where we like walk in like for civil rights, where the majority of individuals are doing most of the work and other individuals' role is just being there as a physical presence and as a body. But that requires attention. Because people lend themselves to protest, they have to be followers, they have to be invigorated, they have to catch their attention. When we're online, we have a limited bandwidth for attention. There's an attention economy because the internet functions like a market. Where platforms and users are competing for likes and content and content consumption, right? So YouTube is like a great example of this, where like individuals have a literal attention economy where we can track who's generating the most ad revenue, right? Like we can track that empirically. And information overload or bad information collected economy going bad for certain movements. I think that the Black Lives Matter protests are fascinating right now, right? Like it's a difficulty to maintain the attention economy necessary to galvanize the reforms that certain individuals are asking for. And things like shock media are one way that we garner that attention economy, by showing things like super horrific images that push individuals to confront things. Shock media can also have the forms sometimes of violence or reading. Violence is how you can use drive over the events, look at you in your group, that kind of thing. Something that was super interesting is like we don't like Mike Bloomberg, just so you know. But Mike Bloomberg's 2020 campaign collaborated with a group. So I'm not going to say that word, but there's like a meme group that like has this name, and they collaborated with Mike Bloomberg. You can like do like some wiki searches on this, and they created the Mike meme campaign. Did like y'all see these? Yeah, Jonathan saw them, and like they were really interesting. Like they were like literally memes that bagged on Mike Bloomberg. Like almost all of them were like Mike Bloomberg's a bad guy. Like that was the point of the meme. But Mike Bloomberg himself paid for them to be commissioned, all because that meme creative group said this is a good idea. People are gonna like it. We create memes all the time. We know what folks like, and this will get you information. What was fascinating about this campaign is that it wasn't positive advertising for Mike Bloomberg. It was specifically about the attention economy, just getting the move to him first and then worrying about attitudes and thoughts later. Yeah, awesome. I think we have like 2 or 3 minutes. So what do we think? What do we think about life? What do we think about the social media and the public sphere and Twitter, tear gas?
So for like the attention economy, I don't know, like there's always the saying like all press is good press or whatever, and I guess that kind of applies here. But when you look at things like slacktivism, where like major issues get like a lot of attention, but like a lot of that attention is just like people posting black squares, so it's like hard to actually see a lot of change. Like, is that still beneficial within like the attention economy, or is that kind of like dragging on it?
So I think so. So, and there's like, I know another elective on hashtag activism that will probably go deep into the ways that hashtag activism is maybe like not the best. But I want to push back because I think that the attention economy, especially by the Mike Bloomberg campaign, shows that you're within that like attention is like what you need first, right? Like people have to first have their eyes set on something before they can issue judgment. This brings us back to the diagram of the public sphere. That judgment is a process that results afterwards, after the conversation has enough interlocutors or enough relevance. It's the process that is a result of information that already has the capture of the economy. It's like, so it's like, sure, hashtag activism, not the best in terms that it doesn't achieve the most. But we also know that I think all these rules that we've talked about, like the 2080 rule, show that sometimes you just need to get populations to have access to that kind of information in the first place. I think the hashtag activism is like an ongoing debate where like we really don't know how good or how bad it is. I think it'll take like literal, like probably years before we can use data to measure how our individuals' attitudes matching their online performances. But I think that hashtag activism also gets back to this idea of digital dualism, that somehow the online world is somehow a less real world. The individuals who are publicly claiming support for things are somehow doing so in a less real way. That's interesting. I think it deserves to be interrogated. But I think I would I would err on the side that any media is good media for a movement. Yeah. What's up, Ashley?
No, I was just wondering, like, I was kind of going off John's point, like, if we already are in echo chambers and no one around us, like, at least for me, I don't think that I follow anyone who's like a Trump supporter or someone who like is really against what I believe in. Kind of adding on to John, just like, if that's the case and we already are in those echo chambers and are surrounded by people with those similar interests and backgrounds, what benefits come out of like just adding something to your story that everyone else already believes in or everyone knows about?
Sure. So I think that I'm going to introduce us to something else here. Let's see, share screen. Sociologists tell us that we have two kinds of ties. Right, so you have weak ties to like, when this is like when you go to college, you have weak ties to former classmates, maybe like second cousins, former co-workers, etc. And you have strong ties to like all of your really close friends. The majority of your Instagram followers, I think, are a combination of varying levels of weak ties. If I asked everybody to go to their social media feed and filter it down to 50 individuals that you can only interact with those 50, like in real life. Like go to your Instagram feed, pick 50, and those are people that see you every single day in the real world. You could probably do it, and it'd be probably difficult, and you would like have a lot of people that you didn't see anymore. I think that social media is a combination of weak and strong ties, and social media is the only place where we maintain consistent access to our weak ties. I don't talk to my former classmates at home. I don't talk to them anywhere else. My second cousins, I don't talk to them anywhere else. I don't talk to my former coworkers. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter are the only place that people that I no longer see physically in my life anymore, I still see all the time. So I think that the idea of echo chambers is definitely true. We opt into the content that we prefer. But I think the warrant that we need to respond to that argument is that yes, that's one method of doing it. We opt into like content, but we also use social media to network. And we're constantly tasked with coming into contact with different people all the time, at school, at work, and at family. And weak ties are on social media. And again, it's weak. Like there's that part of it. I will go to like my Instagram, and sometimes I'll like click on all these little stories like at the top. And to be honest, I don't remember most of the people whose stories I watch. I'm like, I don't know who they are. I don't remember where I met them, but I think weak ties are the place where we do burst those echo chambers, because social media is the only place where we maintain weak ties of any kind for a long period of time. Awesome. Any other questions? I'm gonna give you like 25 minutes of a break before your next activity, because I think like in 30 minutes we have to do things again. Awesome. Y'all have been awesome. Social media is cool. Keep posting things, retweeting things, or don't, because maybe hashtag activism is bad. Interrogate the internet. It's like brand new. We don't know a lot about it. Is it a tool? Is it like democratic? Is it anti-democratic? I mean, I don't know. Awesome. Cool. So if there's not any other questions, y'all can all go. I think I'm gonna hold on before I actually let y'all go. Let me be more responsible than that for a second by figuring out what happens next. Technically speaking, let me stop recording.